Tanya Williams stood in the courtroom with a quiet confidence, her posture straight and eyes fixed on the judge ahead, her black dress sharply contrasting with the dull grays of the room she had entered countless times before as a federal prosecutor. But today, this was different. This wasn't a courtroom where she fought criminals or built cases against powerful men. This was a traffic court, and she was here for something so trivial. She almost couldn't believe it herself. A simple charge of expired registration tags, but in this moment, it felt like more than just an ordinary day in court. As the judge glanced at his paperwork, he looked down his nose at her and raised an eyebrow as if to say he had already decided what kind of person she was. He saw her calm, collected demeanor and assumed she had a hidden agenda. Her calmness irritated him. Her confidence felt out of place in a room like this. In a case like this, she had not shown the signs of nervousness that he expected from most people in this situation. And to him, that only meant one thing: she was hiding something. Her guilt was obvious because she didn't look like she cared, and it rubbed him the wrong way. Tanya could feel the judge's eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't nervous. She was used to facing far more intimidating situations than this, but the feeling that something was off lingered in the air, as if the very space between them had shifted. She was aware of how she was being judged, not for what she had done, but for who she was. She was black, a woman, and she could sense the subtle disdain in the judge's expression, as if her presence alone was a challenge to his authority. He asked her to explain herself, and in that moment, Tanya could feel the weight of his assumptions, his tone sharp and dismissive as he interrupted her halfway through her explanation. His impatience was palpable. She tried to remain composed, but his disregard for her words stung. She was being dismissed, not as a person, but as an idea, a stereotype that lived in his mind. She wondered how many other people in this very courtroom had faced the same treatment. How many times had the judge judged based on looks or on biases instead of facts? But Tanya was no ordinary person, and this wasn't just a minor traffic violation to her. This was a chance to stand her ground and demand respect for what she knew was right. But the judge was already writing his ruling, a hefty fine. He decided with a finality that left no room for negotiation or understanding. He gave his verdict without so much as a glance in her direction. And with it, Tanya felt the sting of injustice. She wasn't even angry yet, just profoundly disappointed, because she had been here before, seen this before, the way systems worked in ways that favored those who looked like him and pushed down those who looked like her. Without even trying, Tanya took a deep breath as the gavel came down with a resounding thud. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as she stood motionless for a moment before gathering her things. She could feel the judge's eyes on her back as she turned to leave, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something else there in his gaze: confusion, perhaps, or regret. She couldn't be sure, but it didn't matter. The damage had been done. And it wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about a deeper question, one she had spent her life confronting. Could she let this injustice slide, or would she fight for what she knew was right? Tanya walked out of the courtroom with the weight of the fine pressing on her shoulders. But it wasn't just the money that bothered her. It was the feeling of being unseen, of being judged, without a moment's consideration of who she really was. She had grown used to these moments over the years. The quick assumptions, the hurried judgments made based on her appearance, the way people often mistook her calm for submission. But this was different this time. The judge's dismissal was almost personal. It felt like a slap in the face, not because of the fine, but because of the invisible line she could feel between them, the line of bias that separated her from him. She could almost hear the unspoken assumptions that had led to his decision. The way her presence alone had been enough to put her in a category of undeserving. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had faced the same treatment in his courtroom. How many people like her had left with their dignity bruised, but not broken. Tanya wasn't broken, not by a long shot, but that didn't mean she didn't feel the sting of it all as she made her way out of the courthouse. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another moment in a long line of battles she had fought in a system that wasn't designed for people like her. She had fought for years in the courtroom as a federal prosecutor, standing up against corrupt politicians and ruthless criminals. But this was different. It wasn't a case of law or policy. It wasn't a battle she could win by quoting statutes or outsmarting her opponents. This was personal. This was about how people like her were seen by those in power, and how often they were dismissed because of who they were and what they looked like. The thought of letting this go made her stomach churn, so she decided right then and there that she wouldn't just pay the fine, she would fight it. She would make sure that Judge Harper knew that he had made a mistake, that he had judged her not as a person, but as a stereotype. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, it never was, but if there was one thing Tanya had learned in her career, it was that the fight was worth it. Even when the odds were stacked against her, she had seen it time and time again in her work as a prosecutor. People underestimated her all the time, but she had built her reputation on proving them wrong, on showing them that just because they thought she was easy to dismiss didn't mean she would go away quietly. And so as she sat in her office later that afternoon, staring at the fine paperwork in front of her, she made a decision. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket. It was about something much bigger. It was about the systemic bias she had spent years fighting against, and the chance to take on something that went far beyond the courtroom. It was about showing everyone that people like her wouldn't be erased, wouldn't be overlooked, and certainly wouldn't be silenced by an unjust system. She wasn't going to let this slide, and she would make sure Judge Harper knew exactly who he had crossed. She would fight for her dignity and for the dignity of every person who had ever been judged by their skin color or gender instead of their character. Tanya spent the following days stewing over the courtroom incident, replaying the judge's words in her mind, and thinking of ways she could challenge the fine. Her colleagues urged her to let it go, arguing that the fine was a small matter compared to the high-profile cases she was handling. But Tanya couldn't shake the feeling that this was a moment that demanded action. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about the principle of it, the disregard for her as an individual, the blatant assumption that she was just another person who could be easily dismissed because of her race and gender. In her office late one evening, Tanya sifted through legal documents, the hum of her office lights providing the only sound as she meticulously researched Judge Harper's history. She had seen his name before in the media, often as a tough but fair judge, known for his no-nonsense attitude. But as Tanya dug deeper, the image of the fair judge began to crack. His record, particularly in cases involving people of color, was troubling. Over the years, he had handed down harsher sentences to black and brown defendants, often citing flimsy reasoning or inconsistent justifications for his rulings. Tanya's gut tightened as she read through case after case where Harper's decisions appeared to be influenced more by implicit bias than the law itself. It was then that Tanya realized this wasn't just about her fine. It was about a system that allowed people like Judge Harper to wield unchecked power without accountability. The anger she felt was visceral. She had spent years prosecuting dangerous criminals who used their power and influence to exploit others, but now she was up against a different kind of power, the institutionalized prejudice that ran deep in the very systems she worked within. This was no longer just a matter of personal bias. It was a systemic issue that she couldn't ignore. Tanya knew that fighting this wasn't just about her pride or her career. It was about something bigger, something that could send a message to others who had been similarly harmed. Tanya's investigation into Judge Harper's rulings revealed something else too: his connections to several high-profile political figures who had been caught up in corruption scandals. She found patterns where Harper had been unusually lenient toward politicians and wealthy individuals with connections to his past, while imposing extreme sentences on marginalized defendants. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the justice system was flawed in ways that were often invisible, but no less damaging. What's worse, Judge Harper's biases were only a small part of a much larger, more insidious problem. Determined to hold him accountable, Tanya took the first step. She filed an official complaint with the Judicial Oversight Committee, detailing her findings about Harper's biased record. But she didn't stop there. Tanya reached out to a few of her trusted colleagues within the Department of Justice to see if they could help her further investigate Harper's conduct. They were all on board, ready to dig deeper and uncover the truth. Tanya knew this would be a long fight, but she wasn't about to let an unjust system go unchallenged. This was her fight, and she would see it through, no matter how difficult the road ahead. By the time the week came to a close, Tanya was more determined than ever. The fine was no longer the issue, it was the corruption, the inequality, and the biased systems that had been allowed to thrive unchecked for too long. Judge Harper's actions had sparked something in her, a call to action that she could no longer ignore. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, overlooked, or cast aside by a system that didn't value them. And Tanya Williams was going to make sure the world knew it. Tanya's search for justice had now taken on a life of its own. Her decision to challenge Judge Harper wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about making sure people in power faced the consequences of their biases. The more she dug into Harper's past decisions, the more she was appalled by the glaring inconsistencies. She knew she had to keep pushing, but she also knew this fight wouldn't be easy. Harper was a fixture in the local judicial community, with decades of service under his belt. Exposing his flaws would be like shaking the foundation of a system that had allowed him to thrive unchallenged for years. One evening, as Tanya sat in her office reviewing case files, she received an unexpected call from Darren, one of her colleagues at the Department of Justice. Darren was involved in a major corruption case against a powerful politician, and during a casual conversation, the topic of Judge Harper came up. As it turned out, Harper had been assigned to oversee the case, a case that had already drawn a lot of media attention. The coincidence sent a chill down Tanya's spine. She couldn't ignore the connection. This was no longer just about a traffic fine or a personal vendetta. It was about something much larger. Tanya was no stranger to corruption, but now she had a direct link between the very judge who had dismissed her case and one of the most influential political scandals in recent years. Harper had been involved in overseeing cases that seemed to favor political elites, and as Tanya dug deeper into his rulings, it became clear that he had a history of giving lighter sentences to individuals with political ties while showing no mercy to those less connected. She began to see how deeply entrenched the system was in protecting its own, and how much work was left to be done to expose it. Determined to understand the full scope of Harper's influence, Tanya began to investigate his personal and professional connections. She learned about his ties to wealthy businesspeople and politicians who had cases before him, noticing a troubling pattern of leniency when it came to their sentencing. Meanwhile, his harsh treatment of defendants who were black or brown was undeniable. It wasn't just about being unfair. It was a systemic problem that had been perpetuated for years, and it was time to bring it to light. One afternoon, after days of combing through court records and legal documents, Tanya stumbled upon something that made her heart race. There was an email exchange between Harper and an associate of a prominent local politician, a person who had been involved in the corruption scandal Darren was investigating. The email detailed the judge's lenient ruling on a case involving the politician's family, and it was clear that Harper had been influenced, at the very least, by their relationship. Tanya felt the adrenaline rush through her veins. This was the smoking gun she had been waiting for, the evidence that would make her case much stronger than just a personal complaint. She knew it wouldn't be easy to bring this information to light. Harper was well connected, and challenging him meant stepping into a dangerous game. But Tanya had no choice. She had already started this journey, and now she was too deep to back out. Tanya wasn't alone in this fight, though. Darren, along with a few trusted colleagues, offered their support. They promised to back her up if she moved forward with her complaint, and together they began planning their next steps. They knew they couldn't just file a simple complaint anymore. This had to be bigger. They had to go public. The corruption at play here was too vast to keep hidden. The next few days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. Tanya knew what she had to do, but the weight of it all was starting to take its toll. The system that had allowed her to fight for justice for others was now one that she had to take on herself. But she was ready. This fight was hers to win, and she wouldn't stop until Harper's wrongs were righted. The day of the appeal hearing arrived, and Tanya's resolve had only hardened since she first walked out of Judge Harper's courtroom. The fine, which seemed so trivial at first, had grown into a symbolic representation of something far more significant: the unchecked biases in the system, the presumption of guilt based on race, and the pervasive attitude that people like her were to be dismissed without a second thought. Tanya had spent days preparing, her mind razor-sharp with all the facts, her arguments honed to perfection. But this wasn't just about legalities, it was about making sure her voice, and the voices of countless others, were heard. She arrived at the courthouse early, the weight of the upcoming battle heavy in her chest. Tanya had seen the inside of courtrooms more times than she could count, but this time felt different. There was a sense of purpose in the air, a quiet but powerful determination to hold someone accountable, not just for a fine, but for the pattern of discrimination that had marked her entire experience in the justice system. She stood in front of the courthouse, letting the crisp morning air fill her lungs, preparing herself for what she knew would be a tense confrontation. As she walked into the courtroom, Tanya could feel all eyes on her. She was no longer just the woman who had gotten a traffic ticket. She was the woman who was taking on the system, and people could sense that. Her demeanor was calm, collected, but there was a fierceness behind her eyes that made her stand out. She could feel the murmurs around her, the whispered questions, the curiosity from those who had no idea what she was really capable of. But none of it mattered. She had a job to do, and she would do it. Judge Harper entered the courtroom, his usual stern expression on his face. But as soon as his eyes landed on Tanya, there was a flicker of recognition. He had seen her before, perhaps he remembered her from the original hearing, or maybe he recalled the buzz surrounding her name. Whatever it was, there was something different in the way he looked at her now. His confidence, the kind he had worn like armor in their first encounter, seemed slightly more fragile today. Tanya took her place at the podium, her posture straight and unwavering. She began with a measured tone, explaining the circumstances of her case and why the fine was excessive. But as she spoke, her voice grew steadier, more assertive, as she moved beyond the simple issue of the expired registration tags and into the larger question of fairness in the system. She spoke of how judges like Harper, whether intentionally or not, perpetuated a system that consistently marginalized people of color. She spoke of how, in that very courtroom, her character had been dismissed not for what she had done, but for who she was. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Tanya didn't back down. She knew what she was saying was important. She could feel the weight of every word, knowing that this moment could be her chance to shift the narrative. It wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about the thousands of others who had faced the same silent dismissal, the same unspoken judgment. Then, in a move that took everyone by surprise, Tanya revealed something she had kept hidden until now. "I am a federal prosecutor," she said, her voice calm but steady. "And I've spent years in courtrooms, putting criminals away, criminals who thought they were above the law because of their wealth, their status, or their connections. But today, I'm standing here because I was judged by the same biases that criminals rely on to escape accountability." A stunned silence filled the room. The judge's expression hardened as Tanya's words hit their mark. She wasn't just a woman challenging a fine. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had the power to expose the flaws of the very system Harper represented. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge fumbled with his papers, trying to regain his composure. Tanya had known this would be a turning point, but she hadn't anticipated just how powerful the moment would feel. She wasn't just challenging a court ruling. She was challenging an entire system of injustice, and it felt as though she had finally found the leverage to do so. Now, it was up to Judge Harper to decide how far his biases would take him. Would he continue to allow his assumptions to dictate his decisions, or would he acknowledge the truth she had laid before him? The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Harper took a deep breath and looked directly at Tanya. He had no idea what was coming next. Judge Harper took a long moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied Tanya. The room was tense, the air thick with expectation. For the first time since Tanya had walked into his courtroom, the judge seemed to hesitate, his previously confident demeanor shaken. Tanya could see the wheels turning in his mind, the realization that he was no longer dealing with just another defendant. He was now face to face with someone who knew how to navigate the system better than he ever could have imagined. Tanya held his gaze, unwavering. She knew that her words had made an impact. This wasn't just about her case anymore. It was about making a statement that would echo far beyond this courtroom. She was standing up not only for herself, but for all the people who had been overlooked, dismissed and unfairly judged because of their race or background. She could feel the weight of the moment, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The judge cleared his throat, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. Finally, he spoke, his voice sounding less sure than before. I appreciate your perspective, Ms. Williams, he began, but his words trailed off as though he was searching for something to say that would regain control of the situation. However, we're here to discuss your case, not broader issues of bias and discrimination in the system. Tanya didn't let him finish. She wasn't about to be sidetracked into a narrow conversation about her fine. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but firm, this case isn't just about a traffic violation. It's about the larger pattern of how people like me, people who are black, are treated differently in courtrooms like this. It's about the systemic bias that's ingrained in the very structure of our justice system. You've made it clear that you see me as just another person to dismiss. But I'm not just another person. I'm a federal prosecutor, and I know firsthand how the law can be twisted to protect the powerful. Today, I'm asking you to acknowledge that we, too, deserve fairness. There was a murmur from the audience, some agreeing with Tanya's statement, others remaining silent, uncomfortable with the confrontation unfolding before them. But Tanya didn't care. She was done being quiet. The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch on forever, and for a moment, Judge Harper said nothing. Finally, he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound broke the tension in the room. I understand what you're saying, he muttered, his tone begrudging, but there was an unmistakable note of uncertainty in his voice now. But you must understand that I have to follow the law. Then why, Your Honor, Tanya asked, leaning forward just slightly, did you not follow it in my case? Why did you make assumptions about me based on my appearance and my demeanor before you even knew who I was or what I do for a living? Harper froze for a moment, his mouth opening as if to respond, but then he closed it, staring down at the papers on his desk. Tanya knew that he couldn't deny the truth any longer. He was caught, and the walls that had once shielded him from accountability were crumbling before his eyes. The power dynamics that had so easily worked in his favor now felt less secure. Ms. Williams, he trailed off again, seemingly at a loss for words. I have made mistakes, he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Tanya's heart raced. This was it, the opening she needed. She wasn't about to let him backpedal or excuse his behavior. Your mistakes have consequences, Your Honor, she said sharply, but not without compassion. People like me have been paying for those mistakes for far too long, and it's time for that to stop. For the first time in the entire hearing, Judge Harper's expression softened just slightly. He looked at Tanya not with the skepticism he had worn so confidently earlier, but with something resembling understanding, or at least a hint of it. He paused again, this time for longer, as though weighing his next words carefully. Then, slowly, he nodded, his voice quieter than it had been all morning. I will review your case, he said, his tone more neutral now, though the implication was clear. He was reconsidering his decision. Tanya stood still, not daring to speak, as the judge turned his attention to the courtroom, addressing the court. I will adjourn for now, he said. I need time to reassess the matter. We'll reconvene soon. As the room began to empty, Tanya felt a strange sense of both relief and unease. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But today, she had taken a significant step forward. She had made Judge Harper see her not as just another person to dismiss, but as someone with the power to hold him, and the system, accountable. The real fight had only just begun. The days that followed the hearing felt like an eternity to Tanya. She had done everything she could to make her case, to expose the biases that had been entrenched in the courtroom for far too long. But now, the waiting was the hardest part. It was like holding her breath, unsure of whether her efforts would truly make a difference, or whether it would all fade into nothingness. Like so many other cases of injustice she had seen throughout her career. In the meantime, the news of her challenge against Judge Harper began to spread. The media had caught wind of her actions, and soon local news outlets were reporting on the trial and the tension surrounding the case. Some reporters hailed Tanya as a trailblazer, a fierce advocate for justice willing to challenge the system that had held her back. Others, however, questioned her motives, painting her as an overzealous prosecutor with a personal vendetta. But Tanya didn't let the noise distract her. She knew the stakes were too high for that. Late one afternoon, Tanya received a call from Darren. He had been following the developments closely, keeping tabs on Judge Harper's movements, trying to gauge how far the judge would go to defend himself. "Tanya," Darren's voice was tense. "We have something." Tanya's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" "There's been a significant shift," Darren continued. "Word has gotten out about the Oversight Committee looking into Harper's rulings. We've already gathered testimony from several attorneys who've had similar experiences in his courtroom. Unwarranted fines, discriminatory sentencing. They're starting to take it seriously." Tanya could hardly believe what she was hearing. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when all of her hard work, her sacrifice, her unwavering commitment to exposing the truth was starting to pay off. The system she had long tried to fix was finally starting to bend under the weight of her persistence. "But there's more," Darren said, a hint of urgency in his voice. "You're not going to believe this, but it looks like Harper's been involved in a much deeper scandal than we thought. He's been taking bribes from some of the very people he's been lenient with in court, business owners, politicians. There's proof. We've got the evidence." Tanya's pulse quickened. This was bigger than she could have imagined. She had known something was off about Harper, but this was corruption at its core, and it was being laid out in front of her like a map she could follow to bring him down. Darren continued, "We've managed to track down financial records that connect him to some of these powerful figures. It's all coming together. If we can expose this, we'll not only discredit him, but we'll start to unravel the whole system he's been part of." Tanya felt the weight of this new information settle on her. It was a moment of reckoning. She had been fighting for justice, but now it felt like she was standing on the edge of something much bigger than she had imagined. A movement, a shift in the way people viewed the system. But she knew this would be a delicate battle. Exposing corruption at this level would not come without consequences. Harper had powerful allies, people who would do whatever it took to protect him. Tanya had seen how corrupt the system could be when powerful individuals were threatened. But she wasn't afraid. She had come this far, and now there was no turning back. "I'll do whatever it takes," Tanya said firmly. "Get me the evidence. We're going to take him down, and we're going to make sure the truth is heard." The next few days were a blur as Tanya and Darren worked together to gather all the evidence, connecting the dots that would prove Harper's involvement in the scheme. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place with alarming clarity, and soon they had everything they needed to bring the case forward. But Tanya knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The moment they exposed Harper's corruption, they would be putting themselves in the line of fire. But for Tanya, there was no choice. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt judge. It was about taking down an entire system that had allowed him and people like him to operate unchecked. The fight was about to get even more dangerous, but Tanya was ready. The truth was in her hands, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The day of reckoning had arrived, and Tanya could feel the weight of everything she had worked for hanging in the balance. She had fought for weeks to gather evidence, worked alongside Darren and trusted colleagues to piece together the undeniable truth of Judge Harper's corruption. Today, they would present it all, and Tanya knew that the moment she stepped into that courtroom, her life would never be the same. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with tension as Tanya entered. The judge's bench, usually a symbol of authority and impartiality, now felt like a stage for a much larger drama, one that went beyond her case. The audience, a mix of reporters, legal professionals, and a few curious onlookers, seemed to hold their breath as the proceedings began. Even the usually unflappable Judge Harper looked visibly uneasy, his normally confident posture replaced with a slight rigidity, as though he sensed the storm that was about to hit. Tanya stood at the podium, feeling the weight of her own determination. She wasn't just a prosecutor today. She was a symbol of resistance, a voice for all those who had been treated unfairly, all those who had been dismissed by a corrupt system that thought it could get away with injustice. She looked directly at Judge Harper, and for the first time, she could see a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. It was a small crack in the armor, but it was enough to give her the strength to move forward. She began by recounting her initial experience in his courtroom, the way she had been treated, the assumptions he had made about her without even knowing who she was. Then she shifted the focus, bringing to light the broader implications of his actions. She presented the evidence of his biased rulings, his undue leniency toward political elites and wealthy defendants, and his harsh sentences for people of color. But this was just the beginning. As Tanya laid out the full extent of Harper's misconduct, a hush fell over the courtroom. The financial records, emails, and testimony she had uncovered were irrefutable. The bribery, the favors, the backroom deals, it was all there in black and white, and it was undeniable. Judge Harper had used his position to further his own interests and protect the powerful, all while sentencing the marginalized to harsh consequences for the smallest infractions. Her words cut through the room like a blade. "This is not just about my case," Tanya said, her voice unwavering. "This is about every case where justice was distorted, every case where someone was punished not for their actions, but for their race, their status, or their background. This is about the corrupt system that allowed Judge Harper to operate unchecked for so long. And today it ends." Judge Harper's face had drained of color as Tanya's words rang out, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the evidence in front of him. Tanya knew that his silence wasn't one of confidence, it was one of fear. He could no longer deny the truth. The facts were laid bare, and the system that had protected him for so long was beginning to crumble. Tanya turned to the room, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had gathered. "This isn't just my fight. It's a fight for every person who has been discriminated against in this very building. For every person who has been overlooked or silenced by the very institutions that are supposed to protect them. Today, we are taking the first step toward a system that truly upholds justice." There was a palpable shift in the room. The spectators, the reporters, even the other attorneys seemed to feel the gravity of the moment. Tanya wasn't just making her case, she was making history. And then it was Judge Harper's turn. He stood slowly, his hands shaking as he reached for his gavel. The room held its breath. What would he say? Would he admit to the corruption, or would he fight back, try to maintain his power? With a long pause, Harper spoke, his voice hoarse and weary. I have failed in my duties as a judge," he said, his tone heavy with resignation. "The evidence presented is undeniable. I have compromised the integrity of this court, and I will step down immediately from my position. I will face the consequences of my actions." The courtroom was still for a moment, as if everyone was processing the enormity of the moment. Tanya felt a wave of relief wash over her, but there was no triumph in her heart. This was only one victory in a much larger war. She had exposed the truth, but there was still much to be done to dismantle the systems of inequality that had allowed such corruption to thrive. As Tanya walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the day still hanging on her shoulders, she knew that this was just the beginning. Her fight wasn't over. But for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The truth had been spoken, and for once, it had been heard.